Hello, welcome back. We've been reading The Iron Man by Ted Hughes. We left off where the Iron Man had been caught and buried in the ground, but a family who were picnicking over that ground may have woken him up. "Run to the car!" shouted the father. They all ran. They jumped into the car. They drove. They did not look back. So they did not see the great iron head, square like a bedroom, with red glaring headlamp eyes, and with the tablecloth, still with the chicken and the cheese draped across the top of it, rising out of the top of the hillock as the Iron Man freed himself from the pit. When the farmers realised that the Iron Man had freed himself, they groaned. What could they do now? They decided to call the army, who could pound him to bits with anti-tank guns. But Hogarth had another idea. At first the farmers would not hear of it, least of all his own father. But at last they agreed. Yes, they would give Hogarth's idea a trial, and if it failed, they would call in the army. After spending a night and a day eating all the barbed wire for miles around, as well as hinges he tore off gates and tin cans he found in ditches, and 3 new tractors and 2 cars and a lorry, the Iron Man was resting in a clump of elm trees. There he stood, leaning among the huge branches, almost hidden by the dense leaves, his eyes glowing a soft blue. The farmers came near along the lane in their cars, so they could make a quick getaway if things went wrong. They stopped 50 yards from the clump of elm trees. He really was a monster. This was the first time most of them had had a good look at him. His chest was as big as a cattle truck. His arms were like cranes, and he was getting rusty, probably from eating all the old barbed wire. Now, Hogarth walked up towards the Iron Man. "Hello!" he shouted, and stopped. "Hello, Mr. Iron Man!" The Iron Man made no move. His eyes did not change. Then Hogarth picked up a rusty old horseshoe and knocked it against a stone. Clonk, clonk, clonk. At once the Iron Man's eyes turned darker blue, then purple, then red, and finally white, like a car headlamp. It was the only sign he gave of having heard. "Mr. Iron Man," shouted Hogarth, "we've got all the iron you want, all the food you want, and you can have it all for nothing if only you'll stop eating up all the farms." The Iron Man stood up straight. Slowly he turned. He was looking directly at Hogarth. "We're sorry we trapped you and buried you," shouted the little boy. "We promise we'll not deceive you again. Follow us and you can have all the metal you want, brass too, aluminium too, and lots of old chrome. Follow us." The Iron Man pushed aside the boughs and came into the lane. Hogarth joined the farmers. Slowly they drove back down the lane, and slowly, with all his cogs humming, the Iron Man stepped after them. They led through the villages. Half the people came out to stare, half ran and shut themselves inside bedrooms and kitchens. Nobody could believe their eyes when they saw the Iron Man marching behind the farmers. At last they came to the town, and there was a great scrap metal yard. Everything was there. Old cars by the 100, old trucks, old railway engines, old stoves, old refrigerators, old springs, bedsteads, bicycles, girders, gates, pans. All the scrap iron of the region was piled up there, rusting away. "There!" cried Hogarth. "Eat all you can." The Iron Man gazed, and his eyes turned red. He kneeled down in the yard. He stretched out on one elbow and he picked up a greasy black stove and chewed it like a toffee. There were delicious crumbs of chrome on it. He followed that with a double-decker bedstead, and the brass knobs made his eyes crackle with joy. Never before had the Iron Man eaten such delicacies. As he lay there, a big truck turned into the yard and unloaded a pile of rusty chain. The Iron Man lifted a handful and let it dangle into his mouth, better than any spaghetti. So there they left him. It was an Iron Man's heaven. The farmers went back to their farms. Hogarth visited the Iron Man every few days. Now the Iron Man's eyes were constantly a happy blue. He was no longer rusty. His body gleamed blue like a new gun barrel, and he ate endlessly. One day there came strange news. Everybody was talking about it. Round eyes, bushy mouths, frightened voices. Everybody was talking about it. One of the stars in the night sky had begun to change. This star had always been a very tiny star of no importance at all. It had shone up there for billions and trillions and zillions of years in the constellation of Orion, the great shape of the giant hunter that strides across space on autumn and winter nights. In all its time, this tiny star had never changed in any way. Now suddenly, it began to get bigger. Astronomers peering through their telescopes noticed it first. They watched it with worried frowns. That tiny star was definitely getting bigger, and not just bigger, but bigger and bigger and bigger. Each night it was bigger. Bigger than the dog star, the large coloured twinkler at the heel of the hunter Orion. Bigger than Jupiter, the great blazing planet. Everybody could see it clearly, night after night, as it grew and grew and grew. They stared up with frightened faces, till at last it hung there in the sky over the world, blazing down, the size of the moon, a deep, gloomy red. And now there could be only one explanation. The star was getting bigger because it was getting nearer and nearer and nearer and nearer. It was rushing towards the world, faster than a bullet, faster than any rocket, faster even than a meteorite. And if it hit the world at that speed, why, the whole world would simply be blasted to bits in the twinkling of an eye. It would be like an express train hitting a bowl of goldfish. No wonder the people stared up with frightened faces. No wonder the astronomers watched it through their telescopes with worried frowns. But all of a sudden, a strange thing. The star seemed to have stopped. There it hung, a deep and gloomy red, just the size of the moon. It got no smaller, it got no bigger. It wasn't coming any nearer, but it wasn't going away either. Now everybody tried to explain why and how this was. What had happened? What was happening? What was going to happen? And now it was that the next strange thing occurred. The astronomers noticed it first. In the middle of the giant star, a tiny black speck appeared. On the second night, the speck was seen to be wriggling and much bigger. On the third night, you could see it without a telescope. A struggling black speck in the centre of that giant red gloomy star. On the fifth night, the astronomers saw that it seemed to be either a bat or a black angel or a flying lizard. A dreadful silhouette flying out of the centre of that giant star straight toward the earth. What was coming out of the giant star? Each night, when the astronomers returned to their telescopes to peer up, this black flying horror was bigger, with slow, gigantic wing beats, with long, slow writhings of its body. It was coming down through space, outlined black against its red star. Within a few more nights, its shape had completely blotted out the red star. The nameless, immense bat angel was flying down at the earth like a great black swan. It was definitely coming straight at the earth. It took several days to cover the distance. Then, for one awful night, its wings seemed to be filling most of the sky. The moon peered fearfully from low on the skyline, and all the people of Earth stayed up, gazing in fear at the huge black movement of wings that filled the night. Next morning it landed on Australia. Brrrump! The shock of its landing rolled round the earth like an earthquake, spilling teacups in London, jolting pictures off walls in California, cracking statues off their pedestals in Russia. The thing had actually landed, and it was a terrific dragon. Terribly black, terribly scaly, terribly knobbly, terribly horned, terribly hairy, terribly clawed, terribly fanged, with vast, indescribably terrible eyes, each one as big as Switzerland. There it sat, covering the whole of Australia, its tail trailing away over Tasmania into the sea, its foreclaws on the headlands of the Gulf of Carpentaria. Luckily, the mountains and hills propped its belly up clear of the valleys, and the Australians could still move about in the pitch darkness under the new sky, this queer, low covering of scales. They crowded towards the light that came in along its scales. Of course, whoever had been on the mountain top when the dragon landed had been squashed flat. Nothing could be done about them. And there the horror sat, glaring out over the countries of the world. What had it come for? What was going to happen to the world now this monstrosity had arrived? You'll find out next time. Until then, goodbye.